Good morning. I would like to first thank the session organizers for inviting me to present along with everyone else. As a forensic anthropologist, I've been involved in numerous searches for clandestine graves involving various forensic search techniques. But one area that I've always found interesting is taphonomy of not only historic period graves but forensic graves. And this is part of my interest in thinking about geophysical grave detection and variables that affect detection. So my title is The Detection of Forensic Graves with GPR in North America, Variables Affecting Detection. I'm John Shultz. My co-author is Dylan Smith. Geophysical research is still a necessity to evaluate variables that affect geophysical grave detection. In particular, it's still important to evaluate various grave and site limitations and their effect on grave detection, as this can improve success of geophysical searches. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief early history of forensic geophysical grave detection in North America with a focus on the US. I will discuss variables affecting detection based on my research and experiences, but only focusing on hand-dug graves. And I will also finish up with a case study. The history of geophysical grave detection history in North America, with an emphasis on the US, begins with NecroSearch. NecroSearch International is a Colorado-based multidisciplinary forensic archaeology group that consists of numerous experts, law enforcement, geophysicists. One of their main goals was to improve search methods for the detection of clandestine graves. In particular, this is the first group that started burying pig carcasses as proxies for human bodies, and they began monitoring them with geophysical tools to understand grave detection. They called this project Project Pig, and they were the ones that determined that GPR was the most important tool for grave detection. In particular, this is the research that inspired the beginnings of using GPR in the US for grave detection, and this is what inspired my research. While I was at the University of Florida, I worked at a very busy forensic anthropology lab that involved skeletal analyses as well as working with law enforcement during searches for skeletal remains and clandestine graves. We had partnered with a soil scientist at UF, and we started using GPR for forensic cases. However, we had no idea what we were doing. While the research at NecroSearch did provide some overview articles, literature is very limited with how to use GPR for forensic cases. This is what led to my dissertation research. So I constructed a large study with 24 carcasses total, 12 large, 12 small. The large were around a mean weight of 64 kilograms. The small were a mean weight of around 30 kilograms. Multiple variables I tested. In particular, I had deep and shallow, around a ½ meter to a meter deep, 2 soil types. Large carcasses were in an ultisoil that had a clay horizon. The small were in an entosoil that consisted of only sand. In addition, I had short-term and long-term carcasses. Half of the carcasses were excavated during the short-term period, which was 12 to 13 months, to evaluate the decomposition state. The remaining half of the long-term were excavated at the 21.5 to evaluate the decomposition state. The decomposition state was then compared with the imagery characteristics for the 500 megahertz antenna to determine when a carcass was detected, what was their decomposition state. I'm going to highlight a few of the important results. In the left profiles, if we look at the lower profile, there are 3 red circles. Within the 3 red circles are 3 shallow buried large carcasses that were all detected, and they were completely skeletonized. We know that the soil was not disturbed because within the blue circle was an empty control grave with no carcass. In the right picture, this area of the site, the clay layer was actually at a shallower depth. So we can see within the two red circles, those two pig carcasses were buried into the clay layer, which obscures the detection somewhat. We can see that there is some disruption of the clay horizon. Then we can see in the yellow circle, the pig that is detected above the clay horizon. We all know that clay does pose issues with detection, subsurface detection. With this set of GPR reflection profiles, we're now looking at detection of the smaller carcasses. On the left are the shallow buried, the right are the deep buried. In all of the red circles, we can see detection of the carcasses. And once again, if we look in the two blue circles, we can see that detection is actually due to the buried remains that are skeletonized and not the soil disturbance. One consideration with these carcasses that were being detected that were only skeletons at this point included, how actually were they detected? There seemed to be quite a bit of confusion in the literature, whether it was the soil, whether it was individual bones. While I did have limited chemical testing for my dissertation, all right, one thing we can see in this picture here is this is a large shallow buried carcass. We can see at 21.5 months, we can see the arrow pointing to this darkened area around the skeleton. We know now, after my dissertation, this area was defined as the cadaver decomposition island. It's a localized area around the body that's altered from the release of decomposition byproducts. We know that this provides increased soil microbial biomass and microbial activity, increases in soil, carbon, pH, nutrients, moisture. Okay, what this actually does is this area increases the soil conductivity around the body. So the cadaver decomposition island, while this area persists, this area will help with the detection of an actual skeleton depending upon the soil type. My next geophysical grave detection project involved grave scenarios. This was the area that still needed to be tested in our literature. Pringle also tested a wrapped carcass in his project. Number of variables that I investigated was now my length of monitoring was for 3 years, still included shallow and deep graves, 1/2 meter and 1 meter. Soil this time was a spotosol, and I evaluated 6 scenarios. I have a picture of the grid on the bottom, and in the upper right involves some of the scenarios. So there were 2 control holes, nothing buried in them, a deep and a shallow. I then had a deep and a shallow naked carcass, a deep carcass with a layer of rocks placed over it in the upper right-hand corner. 1D is a carcass wrapped in a tarp. 2C is a carcass with a layer of lime placed over it. And then 2D is a carcass wrapped in a blanket. These were all common scenarios, burial scenarios that were noted in the literature from actual forensic cases. I'm going to highlight just a few of the important conclusions. Interestingly, at around 12 months, resolution decreased for many of the graves. So we're looking at 12-month imagery. At 12 months, scenario really became important with detection. So we can see the horizontal slice and the reflection profile. The red circle contains the grave with the layer of rocks. The yellow circle contains the carcass wrapped in a tarp. The black circle is actually a control hole where the soil was being detected, and the green circle is where we had the carcass wrapped in a blanket, And more than likely what we're seeing in the horizontal slice, we don't see anything, but we do see a reflection in the reflection profile that was probably detection of the soil disturbance. While scenario definitely plays a role, as we've seen increased detection of two scenarios, the grave with the rocks and the grave with the carcass wrapped in a tarp. We're also seeing with this spodosol issues with detection around a year. We did though see between years 2 and 3 sporadic detection of the burials. We can see that there are a number in these composite horizontal slices here. There are a number of oblong circles indicating that there were certain burials detected, groups of burials detected at different times of year. This was actually correlated with soil moisture. Interestingly, never actually considered soil moisture as something that should be thought about before performing a survey, but I do know the archaeology literature, this is definitely a consideration. When predicting how site and grave variables can affect geophysical detection, it's first important to note that many of these variables are linked and interconnected. Soil moisture we can start with. We know that too much moisture will inhibit detection, but now we know that some moisture is preferable in the soil. Depth may play a role, probably not with a shallow hand-dug grave. It's important to note that the shallower the grave, the decomposition will be increased. So it may be more difficult to detect a shallow grave versus a deep hand-dug grave. Clearly, items added to a grave can increase detection if they are metallic and can be detected by GPR. As we know, scenario will play a role. Things added to the grave can increase detection of that grave. Whether or not grave backfill can be detected as a soil disturbance may be helpful. This is obviously related to soil type. Some soils will be able to detect the soil type for a much longer period of time if we can no longer detect the actual remains in the grave. Subsurface and surface characteristics can also play a role in detected if we're dealing with areas that had been, let's say, cleared of brush and contain stumps. If we're dealing with boulders and other things in the subsurface, this can cause clutter, and it may be difficult to actually discern a reflection that is due to a grave. We also have to consider PMI, the decomposition state of the grave, the state of the CDI, whether or not the CDI is detectable based on the length of the PMI. And so we can think about detection, geophysical detection with these two pictures. Clearly on the left we have active decay, the body's through bloat. The CDI is starting to form as the fluids are purged. The backfill is still, hasn't compacted yet. All right, this clearly will be detected geophysically as well as a soil disturbance with a soil consisting of numerous distinct horizons. Over time, the next picture would be an advanced decomposition where the CDI has developed around the carcass, the cadaver, and we still have numerous soft tissues that are still present, but the body has collapsed, and this has led to the compaction of the backfill. Both instances, more than likely, the graves would be detected through surface features as well as geophysics. When considering grave consisting of skeletal remains that are dry and skeletonized, detection in these instances where there are extended postmortem intervals are going to depend on whether or not there's a grave response from the soil disturbance or the remains themselves. The picture on the left includes an example where we still have a CDI that could potentially be detected, as well as a disruption of the stratigraphic horizons. However, a picture on the right where we have a grave in sand, The soil may no longer be detected, but it could be possible to detect the remains because of the CDI. In the next picture, of an even greater postmortem interval, the CDI may no longer be detected, but the soil disturbance in this type of soil may still be detected around the grave walls. Further, in an instance where we have only sand, it may not be possible to detect a grave in this scenario if there's no longer a response from the soil. GPR. What we can then hope for is that maybe there is information that was learned through the background information provided by the law enforcement. Maybe the body is wrapped and or a metallic object such as a weapon may have been added to the grave that could then increase detection of an older grave with an extended PMI. The forensic case I'm going to discuss involves a geophysical search for a body under a cement slab of a garage floor. This case initially was involved with a mother that went missing for around 3 months. She had initially told coworkers that she feared for her safety from a couple of her children because she had recently inherited money and they wanted a share of the money. When police started investigating this disappearance, they learned that the father had been missing for 15 years. Apparently he was very abusive, and it does not appear to be any searching that ever occurred for the father. During the investigation process by law enforcement, they learned that the garage floor recently had a layer of Chattahoochee stone placed over the floor, and in particular, the garage surface, half of the garage surface contained sheets of steel that appeared to potentially be hiding something. So the stone was essentially covering up the plates of steel. And the picture here consists of a sheriff's working dog that alerted after one of the detectives hit the Chattahoochee stone a few times with a sledgehammer. So when I arrived after the search warrant was served, the garage still needed to be cleaned out, so we went to the backyard and saw that there appeared to be a recently poured cement slabs, so we clearly focused on the garage first. In particular, there was a somewhat square slab right in the back of the house. This is the first area that I surveyed with the GPR. And we can see that there is a GPR 2D transect here where there are no reflections noted, and this area was cleared fairly quickly. We then prepared to survey an area on the side of the house. The picture here, you can see that there are some marks on the cement, and those are the chalk lines for the grid lines for the GPR survey. We decided not to perform this survey because additional information, apparently from a good sister, indicated that the mother was most likely buried at another residence. So when I was finally made it into the garage, we can see here the upper left picture that the sheets of steel were removed, and we can see we're performing the GPR survey over that area. The little map below indicates that there was an area of the slab that had been repaired, and there are 2 transects that are provided from the garage. The upper transect is closest to the wall and not over the repaired area. We don't see any reflections or disturbances in this area. The second transect was directly over that repaired area, and we can see in the GPR profile that the red lines mark the area, the limits of the disturbed area, and show that there is a difference in the subsurface. There is, we could call it a disturbance. We can clearly see this area is different. The lieutenant in charge asked me if I could see a body. Clearly I cannot, but I told him the area was large enough to contain the remains of an adult individual. So the next step involved breaking up the area in the garage floor that had been repaired. First, law enforcement cut the area, then they had to bring in a sledgehammer to break it up because pieces of metal were placed within the cement. Once the crime scene started excavating, they did find the old pieces of cement that had been broken up were laid in the hole, actually on top of the buried skeleton. So here we have a picture here. Skeleton had been wrapped in a tarp, and it was buried from depths from the top of the ground surface from 69 to 97.5 centimeters. The CDI and chemical analysis research has provided a foundation for additional forensic GPR research. This research must be interdisciplinary, involving geoscientists, forensic anthropologists, biologists. Further, this research must involve additional excavations to correlate the GPR imagery characteristics with decomposition stage, the extent of the CDI, as well as the soil conductivity. Hopefully, additional GPR research will provide improved detection of forensic graves by modeling grave and site variables more accurately. Here are my citations. Thank you for your time.